Hello, everybody. So, one of my current students had a question about multiple projections. How can you set up multiple projections inside of Nuke? And maybe give a little bit of context, like where would that actually be useful and why would you want to use that? So, just as a really simple example here, if I were to come in and drop down a card, and then I'll just lay this card flat on the ground and I'll scale it up. And let's say I want to project an image from here. And so if I come over here, I'm just going to go to this drop down menu. I'll say create camera. That'll create a camera for my current position. And I'll make a project 3D. And I'll hook that in over here. I'll hook in a checkerboard over here like that. And then I'll project that image onto my checkerboard, or that checkerboard onto my geometry. And so when I look, I can see this is what I have. So now I'm gonna create another camera angle, and I'm just gonna go over here, create another camera, and oops, let me just pop out. I actually accidentally went back into that camera. So let me just come over here and make sure I say create camera. So that creates another camera over here. And in this part, I'll put down a color wheel. And then I'll make a project 3D. And so now what I can do is I can hook this camera over here, put that in over here. And now if I were to take this, now I could project that image onto the card. So what I have over here is one piece of geometry, and if I want to have two images on it, sometimes what I've seen students do is they will take a copy of that and then they'll put it over here, and then they'll make like a scene to merge these together. So then you have that, and then you have that, and then after that, they might make a Scanline Render and then hook it in here and then hook it into wherever you're going to render from. So I'll make another camera to render. And so if I look at it, then I get something like that. The problem with that, though, is that you're duplicating the geometry. And another thing is that I wanted the color wheel on top, and so I can see right now that because they're in exactly the same place, there could be some confusion as to what actually goes on top of what piece of geometry. So I may have to take that card and just raise it up just a little bit in order so that I know that the color wheel is supposed to go on top of it. But the downside is that I'm duplicating geometry, and for cards it's not such a big deal, but it adds more overhead into your scene. And if you're using assets from the 3D department, it could be that these are a little bit heavy and you don't want to duplicate geometry inside of Nuke if you don't have to, because Nuke's 3D system is kind of old and it slows down if you have a lot of geometry in it. What's worse is sometimes I see, okay, well, if people don't do it that way, then they might make another Scanline Render over here. And so then they don't have them kind of merged together. And so then they have one Scanline Render over here, and then they have this one over here, and then they would make a merge node and say this is the background and this is the foreground. So I've seen this from other people as well, and this is bad because you want to minimize the amount of Scanline Render nodes that you have inside your scene. You can have a scene that has multiple Scanline Render nodes if you need them, but you want to have as few as possible. You don't want to have any that are unnecessarily there, because again, it slows down your scene considerably just by having a lot of them, especially if once you start increasing the multi-samples in order to get some motion blur happening or to increase the quality, then it'll begin to slow down your scene. So we can actually get rid of these nodes over here. We don't actually need those. And what you can do instead is there's a node called merge material or merge mat. And the project 3D node is technically a material node. So if I drop that in over here and then plug that in over here, then I get basically the same thing that I just had. What's happening is that in the 3D space, I'm merging these two materials together, and then they're being projected onto the geometry. What's also kind of cool is inside this merge material, right now it's set to over, so it works just like a merge nodes over, but there are a few other modes that you could use in order to blend things together. It doesn't have as many options as, say Photoshop or the merge node does, but you can have things kind of poke in and out of alpha channels or cut alpha channels, or limit the visibility based on the other layer's alpha channel. So it does have some flexibility there, and it says also merge. Let's see if you have any extra channels, like if this was like a 3D render and you had your other render your other render passes inside here, you could just say merge all the other channels along with the RGB. Okay, so this is the theory behind it, of how you could set up multiple projections. And I'm going to pause the recording here and just set up maybe a couple of really simple shots where this technique might be of interest, where you may want to play around with it a bit. All right, so maybe we have to do some projection thing on the tabletop over here. So I have a piece of geometry that I made from the point cloud generator. So I just made this piece of geometry over here, and so maybe we need to project on that. So what I could do is, in my 3D scene over here, I could pick a frame, and so maybe I want to have one frame that's back here that gets, maybe like some of this information, but then we eventually do get really close, so I need to have some of it at high resolution. So maybe I want to get, I want to use the last frame because that's been really close, but then I pull back a little bit, and then I'm going to get like this part over here. But that's at frame 102. So I want to get both of those bits of information on my projection. So what I could do is if I go over here to frame 167, and if I make a frame hold, and so that's going to freeze my camera at 167, and then I'll just hit Alt F, or Alt K, sorry, to make a clone. And then I'll clone that with the piece of footage that I want to project. And then I'll use a project 3D. And then I'll hook that into the camera, I'll hook that into the footage, and then hook that into the mesh. So when I look, I have this, but you can see, this is great for, like, if I plug that in and I look through the camera, I can see over here that this is going to be very high resolution because, we're taking the last frame just before we reach the edge of the frame. But then as soon as I pull back, I can see that I don't have this over here. So if I want to get this patch, but I still want to keep the high res stuff that I had before, then I could just set up another projection. So maybe I'll come over here and I'll make another frame hold. And then there I'll hold it at frame 120. I'll hit Alt K, and then I'll hook that into the camera. I'll do a project 3D, hook that into the camera, hook that into the image. And then over here now, if I were to just take the whole thing and place it over here, then I can see that now I would get everything that I made my geometry kind of get up to. But over here, you can see that that's going to be a little bit soft because we're a bit further away. There might be some motion blur on it. Let me just make sure I got enough. Oh, maybe I'll go back a bit further. Maybe frame 102. So I'll say 102. That'll change both of them because they're clones. And then now when I look at it over here, okay, so I have this. I need a bit more geometry to get the full length of it, but for now, just pretend that's there. And so I can keep the full resolution if I do a merge material. And so I could say that this is going to be the lower layer, and then this high resolution is going to be the upper layer. And then I can just hook that in to my geometry. So now you can see the difference you see how that over here is a lot sharper than the layer. Now you'll see a bit of a line there, but then you could just add some feathering. You could just roto that out. So on the top layer, if I had this over here and I don't want there to be a hard line there, then I could just make maybe like a roto, and then maybe just roto the area that I want to keep. Oops. So I'll just go over here and just say keep this, and then maybe feather that, so then it transitions to the lower resolution one. Maybe something like that. And then I can do a pre-mult. So when I look at it, it's going to give me that transition. And then when I look over here, I'll have that transition over there. And maybe I'll just set this to auto alpha so that that has an automatic alpha channel. And over here, I'll set this one to replace the alpha channel, just so that this lower level, this lower one will have a solid white alpha on it. So it's just all I'm doing is over here, that's just giving it a white alpha. And then over here, I want to replace the alpha with this one. So over here, I just hit replace. So instead of having a solid alpha, because it's just going to draw a white on top of white. So I say replace, and then it replaces it. And then the pre-mult, and then the merge material, that goes onto the mesh, and then that goes over here. And then if I do a scanline render and then hook it in, then I'll have that. And so you can kind of see the transition here between the one that's a bit higher resolution and then the one over here that's a little bit noisier and a little bit softer. So that's another use of where you might want to use the merge material. Basically, anytime you want to project multiple images onto one piece of geometry, you could use it then. Now, just something to watch out for is, when I start doing stuff in 3D, it's very easy for your Nuke script to get really messy. And, usually what I do is I try to not do this. So when I'm working, I've mentioned this, I think, to most people that are in the course, but I do like to change the node graph colors. So green into the right, or sorry, down and to the right, and then up and to the left. And if there's any dots, I like them to be a little bit bigger. So now I have this that helps make it a little bit more readable. And then what I like to do is if there's something that's feeding into a lot of inputs, I like to kind of put it up. And same thing with this piece of footage, I like to put it up. And then they're going to feed in. And then I start making branches. So I'll hold down Control, and then I'll start drawing out these lines here. And then if this is all going across, I'll try to find like the farthest one. Maybe this one over here is like the farthest one. And then I look for anything else and kind of get a ride on that line. So I'll make another dot over here and put that across. So now if this is going across over here, look for who else is using that. Well, this point cloud generator is using that. So I can just make another dot and try to minimize the amount of diagonal lines that are in your file. So if I come over here, and then this one is being grabbed from there, this one's being grabbed from there, and then this one is actually coming over here. So just by doing that, that's already helping with the readability of this. And then over here we have one projection set up over here. That goes into the project 3D. And so that could be placed into a backdrop. So again, just for readability of your scene. So if I grab these and then put them into a backdrop, you can move the backdrop without moving the nodes if you hold down Control. Otherwise, if you grab a backdrop, the nodes will be selected and then they'll move around with you. But if you just need to move just the backdrop, just hold down Control and then you can move that around underneath. And then over here, same thing. So now these are coming from the image. So the image, I could do the same thing that I did over here. I usually put a dot a bit further down, and then I'll have things branch out from there. And in some cases, when you're dealing with like a 3D setup that's not really built to have really smooth, like it's hard to avoid diagonal lines. Like here, there's a diagonal line coming in, but you do your best just to try to make it as readable as possible. And so again, here's another projection setup that I have over here, so I can put a backdrop with that. And then the point cloud generator, you could either keep it, or sometimes you can put it off to the side if you don't need it anywhere. So it makes it a little bit more readable than what I had before. And one other thing that I don't know if I really touch on too much is in the 3D tools over here, there's a shader, and one of them is called fill mat or fill material. And where this can be useful for is just to poke holes by using a piece of geometry. So this isn't a prime example, or it's not a great example, but I'll just want to show you what this does. Basically, what fill mat will do is it'll put in a color into a piece of geometry, including black, and it'll do that on the RGB. So if I just came in here and if I made just a box or a cube, and I'll plug that into the scene. And I'll just make it a bit smaller. And maybe I'll scale it up a little bit. Oops. And I'll just take the scale. Now what fill mat will do is if I put that in as the material, then what you'll see over here is whatever color I put in, that's the color it's going to render out. But what this is really useful for is it's good to poke holes in your geometry. If you need to make a mat for something, then this is just like a piece of geometry that's in your scene, but it's just colored completely black, so that if you need to, rather than make like an alpha, it'll just fill black in that area. And because it's a 3D object in your scene, if you had a card that was in front of it or behind it, it would respect that 3D geometry. So sometimes that can save you, like instead of rotoing something, sometimes you're able to do it in the 3D scene just with this fill material. So sometimes that can be helpful if you have a complex scene and you need to kind of poke a hole through certain areas. You can do that with this. Okay, that's it. It's just a really quick lesson. So hopefully this is helpful.